What happens when the coldest man in Montreal meets the one woman his shattered little girl refuses to let go of? She wasn't a glamorous au pair with a psychology degree and a glowing LinkedIn profile. She was a broke, round-faced waitress from Verdun who smelled like maple syrup and dish soap. And she needed rent money so badly she'd answered a job listing that made 3 other applicants turn around at the gate. Isla Vaillancourt was not a man who tolerated weakness. As the undisputed head of the Vaillancourt syndicate, he controlled half the port traffic coming into the St. Lawrence, had city councillors returning his calls before their morning coffee, and ran his criminal empire from a lakeside estate in Beaconsfield with the precision of a Swiss watch. He wore suits that cost more than most people's cars. He had a jaw like carved granite, and eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Every man in his orbit was afraid of him. His 4-year-old daughter Isla was not afraid of anything. She was afraid of nothing because she no longer seemed to feel anything at all. 18 months ago, Isla Vaillancourt had been the kind of child who filled every room she entered, laughing at breakfast, narrating her drawings in a constant cheerful stream, pressing her nose against the car window to name every dog she spotted on the boulevard. Then the accident happened. A car bomb intended for Marcus detonated outside their Westmount townhouse on a Tuesday afternoon. Isla's mother, Colette, had been walking out the front door with Isla in her arms. The blast threw them both. Colette died on the way to Montreal General. Isla survived without a single visible scratch. She hadn't spoken a word since. The specialists called it acute trauma-induced selective mutism. They gave Marcus brochures with pastel covers and recommended specialists in Toronto and New York. He hired 4 of them. Isla sat in their cheerful offices with her dark eyes fixed on the middle distance and said absolutely nothing. One therapist, a highly credentialed woman who charged $800 an hour, told Marcus after 6 sessions that Isla needed consistency, warmth, and patience. Marcus had thanked her and then gripped the steering wheel of his Escalade so hard on the drive home that his knuckles went white. He could dismantle a man's entire operation with a phone call. He could not reach his own daughter. The nannies were the next front. 5 of them in 14 months, each one carefully vetted, each one professionally qualified, each one quietly defeated. The first quit after Isla scratched her. The second lasted 3 weeks before announcing the environment was too stressful. The third had a breakdown in the kitchen and called her own therapist from the pantry. The 4th and 5th departed in the same month. The 4th citing a vague sense of dread. The 5th sending a resignation email at 2 in the morning that consisted of a single sentence. "I'm so sorry, I simply cannot." Marcus was out of options. His head of security, a scarred, unflappable man everyone called Renaud, had finally suggested expanding the search radius. That was how they found Hazel. Hazel Brousseau was 26 years old, 5 feet 3, and 265 pounds of sheer stubbornness wrapped in a faded uniform she'd worn to 4 job interviews in the same week. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in Verdun with a radiator that worked intermittently, and a landlord who did not. She had a face that people called sweet when they were being kind and plain when they weren't. Round cheeks, warm brown skin, dark eyes that had a way of seeing through people whether she meant them to or not. She'd been a waitress at Chez Marcel for 3 years, until the restaurant closed in February. She'd picked up shifts at a hotel cleaning crew, done some overnight stocking at a pharmacy on Sherbrooke, and applied for 17 administrative assistant positions in the past 2 months. 14 of them hadn't responded. 2 had rejected her within hours. 1 had called her in for an interview, looked her up and down when she arrived, and told her the position had already been filled. She needed this job. She needed it the way people need air when they've been underwater too long. Her grandmother, Mère Brousseau, had spent her final 2 years in a palliative care home in Laval. Hazel had made sure she was comfortable. She'd brought her real food, not the institutional kind, and she'd held her hand every Sunday until there was no more Sunday left to hold. She'd also signed a repayment agreement with a care home for $11,000 she didn't have, payable in monthly installments she could barely make. The collection letters were starting to arrive with a new kind of urgency. When the placement agency called, Hazel was sitting on her bathroom floor eating toast, because the kitchen table was covered in bills. The counselor sounded apologetic from the first sentence. The position was residential, she explained. Live-in care for a young child in Beaconsfield. The compensation was exceptional, more per week than Hazel made in a month. The child was non-verbal, with a trauma history. The household was private with strict confidentiality terms. The environment was, and here the counselor paused in a particular way, demanding. The last placement left in under 2 weeks, she added. Hazel chewed her toast. Demanding, she thought, was a word people used when they meant something harder than that. But $11,000 and the memory of her grandmother's hand in hers was a very specific kind of motivator. She said yes before the counselor finished the sentence. The gate at the end of the Beaconsfield driveway was the first thing that made Hazel's stomach drop. It was black iron, 10 feet high, flanked by stone pillars with cameras mounted at each corner. A guard in a dark jacket stepped out of a booth and looked at her the way men in dark jackets always looked at her, slowly, skeptically, like she was a problem that needed categorizing. She gave him her name. He murmured it into a radio. There was a pause long enough to make her shift her weight from one foot to the other. The gate swung open. The driveway curved through professionally landscaped grounds before arriving at a house that wasn't, technically, a house. It was a statement. Stone facade, high windows, a heavy oak door that looked like it had been imported from somewhere older and colder. Hazel had grown up in a 3.5 in Verdun. She had cleaned hotel rooms for $22 an hour. She had never stood in front of a building that made her feel quite so specifically like a mistake. She rang the bell anyway. The man who opened the door wasn't a butler. It was Renaud. She'd learn his name later, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and eyes that catalogued her in under 3 seconds. He brought her through a foyer with a chandelier and down a hallway lined with art she recognized was expensive without knowing why, and showed her into a sitting room that had been decorated in the language of controlled restraint. Everything was gray or cream or the color of things that cost money. She stood in the middle of it and tried not to touch anything. Isla Vaillancourt walked in 2 minutes later. Hazel had been warned that he was imposing. The word did not do the reality justice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvering at the temples and a face that looked like it had been constructed to express exactly as much as he chose, and no more. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost what she owed the care home. His eyes moved to her and stayed there, and Hazel had the specific, unnerving sensation of being read like a document. He didn't say hello. He folded his arms. "You're from the Sorcier Agency." "Yes, Hazel Brousseau." He looked at her for a moment in the way people looked when they were deciding whether to bother. She had seen that look on the faces of restaurant managers, of HR coordinators, of the supervisor at the hotel who told her she moved too slowly for the morning rush. She knew how to stand still inside it. "My daughter is 4, Marcus said. She hasn't spoken in 18 months. She has driven away 5 qualified caregivers, each of whom came with excellent references. She doesn't respond to games, incentives, structured activities, or therapeutic approaches. She sits. She watches. She rejects everyone who comes near her." He paused. "The agency sent 4 applicants this week. You're the last one. The others declined after the initial briefing." Hazel nodded slowly. What happened to the briefing? Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but something like recalibration. "I told them the truth." "Then I appreciate that," she said. He tilted his head a fraction. "You're not afraid." "I didn't say that." She met his eyes. "I said I appreciate honesty. Those aren't the same thing." The silence that followed was the particular kind that meant someone was being reassessed. Marcus looked at Renaud. Something passed between them that Hazel couldn't interpret. Then he looked back at her. "I'll have Renaud show you the child's wing. If Isla reacts to you the way she's reacted to the others, I'll arrange transportation back to the city." "That's fair," Hazel said. Isla's room was at the end of the east corridor, past a window that looked out over the frozen lake. The door was open. Inside, a small dark-haired girl sat on the floor in the center of a large, beautiful rug, surrounded by wooden animals she had arranged in careful rows. She did not look up when Hazel appeared in the doorway. Renaud started to say something about procedure. Hazel put her hand up, gently, not rudely, and he stopped. She did not go in. She sat down in the doorway. Not crossing the threshold, not performing enthusiasm, not projecting any of the practiced cheerfulness she'd watched other adults aim at children like a kind of benign assault. She just sat, her back against one side of the doorframe, her knees up, her hands in her lap. Isla continued arranging her animals. A minute passed, then another. Hazel noticed that the girl was grouping them not by species but by something else, color maybe, or size, or some system entirely her own. She watched without commenting on it. From downstairs, faintly, came the sound of men talking. The click of a door. The structural sounds of a large house running its machinery. After perhaps 4 minutes, Isla looked up. She didn't look at Hazel the way the attachment specialist's brochures described, with curiosity or tentative openness. She looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they're trying to identify. Direct, quiet, without expectation. Hazel looked back. She didn't smile too broadly. She didn't wave. She said, at a volume just above a whisper, "That's a good system you've got. I can't quite figure out the logic yet, but it looks deliberate." Isla blinked. "You don't have to explain it," Hazel added. "I'm just saying I noticed." The girl looked back down at her animals. But she didn't turn away. And she didn't get up and leave the room, which, Hazel would later learn, was what she'd done with every single person who'd tried to enter her space in the past year and a half. She simply continued her work, with Hazel sitting quietly at the edge of it. Downstairs, Marcus was standing in the hallway outside the security feed room. On the monitor, Renaud had pulled up the camera covering the east corridor. They watched in silence. The massive man in the doorway with the camera watching the small, round woman sitting on the floor and the small, dark-haired girl who had not moved away. Marcus said nothing for a long time. Then, she didn't leave. Renaud cleared his throat. "No, sir." Neither did the child. No. Marcus looked at the screen for another moment. Then he straightened, adjusted his cuff and said, in the flat, decisive voice he used for things that were settled, "Tell the agency we won't be needing the other candidates." The first weeks were quiet in a way Hazel hadn't expected. Not peaceful. The house had a low-grade tension running through it like current through a wire. Something to do with the men who came and went at irregular hours, the phone calls Marcus took behind closed doors, the way Renaud's eyes moved when a vehicle approached the gate, but quiet in the sense that Isla allowed Hazel to exist near her without resistance. They developed a rhythm. Mornings, Hazel would sit in the room while Isla ate. Not at the table, initially, but on a low bench near the window that overlooked the garden. She didn't press conversation. She talked the way people talked to themselves, lightly, about nothing in particular. She described what she was doing. "I'm going to make you some oatmeal. I put maple syrup in it because that's what my grandmother used to do." She said plain oatmeal is a personal failure. Easter would look at her briefly, then look away. But she ate. In the afternoons, Hazel did something no one in the household had done in months. She baked. She had asked Marcus carefully if she could use the industrial kitchen, and he had looked at her with that flat, measuring expression and said yes in a tone that suggested he wasn't sure why she was asking. She made butter tarts, torchère in miniature portions, bannock because she'd learned how from a woman she'd worked with at the hotel. The smell moved through the house like a living thing. The guard stationed near the kitchen started finding reasons to pass by more frequently. He started appearing in the kitchen doorway. She never came all the way in, not at first. She stood at the edge and watched. Hazel didn't make an event of it. She narrated quietly, passed Isla a piece of dough to touch when she drifted a half-step closer. Didn't comment when the girl retreated. She understood, somewhere in her bones, that this child wasn't broken. She was waiting. She was waiting to find out whether it was safe to stop waiting. Marcus began coming home earlier. He wouldn't have admitted it, probably, if pressed. He told himself it was because of the Arsenault situation, a territorial dispute that required his presence in the city by evening rather than late night. But Renaud, who had known him for 11 years and survived 3 different attempts on his employer's life, noticed that Marcus came home early on evenings when the kitchen smelled like something warm and Isla was reported to be calm. He noticed other things too. The way Marcus stood at the edge of the kitchen archway some evenings with a glass of scotch, watching Hazel and Isla at the island. The child pressed against Hazel's side while Hazel narrated the folding of pastry with the patient attention she gave everything. The way Marcus's jaw was different in those moments, still hard but still in a different way, not braced. One evening, Marcus came in to find Hazel standing at the sink washing dishes and Isla sitting on the counter beside her, which was either a safety violation or a breakthrough, depending entirely on your perspective, holding a wooden spoon and touching it to the edge of the mixing bowl in a rhythmic, thoughtful tap. Marcus stopped in the kitchen doorway. Hazel didn't jump, though she'd heard his step. She turned slightly and said, "I hope you don't mind the counter situation." She climbed up herself and I decided not to make it a thing. Marcus looked at his daughter. Isla looked back at him. Same dark eyes, same level gaze, and then looked back at the mixing bowl. "What are you making?" he asked. "Molasses cookies," Hazel said. "My grandmother's recipe. It's probably not what someone with a kitchen like this is used to." "I grew up in Rosemont," Marcus said. "My mother made molasses cookies." Hazel glanced at him then, briefly. Something in his face had shifted. He was still the most controlled person she'd ever been in a room with. But there was a seam in it, small and just visible, like light under a closed door. She turned back to the dishes. "They'll be ready in about 20 minutes, she said. "There'll be enough for the men at the front gate. I'd be leaving things out there. I hope that's all right. You've been feeding my security detail." "They look cold," Hazel said, "and a man who's had a hot cookie pays better attention than a man who hasn't." "That's not my observation. That's just logic." Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the place a smile would have been. He left without saying anything else. He came back 23 minutes later, took a cookie from the rack without asking, ate it standing at the island, and poured Hazel a coffee without being asked to. She wrapped her hands around the mug and said nothing, which seemed to be exactly the right response. It was a Tuesday in March when things changed. Hazel had taken Isla to the small playground on the far end of the property, a concession Marcus had built when Isla was 2 and which the child had not used since the accident. Hazel hadn't pushed. She'd mentioned it casually one morning, the way she mentioned everything, and 3 days later, Isla had put on her coat without being asked. They had been there for 20 minutes. Isla was not on the equipment. She was crouched at the edge of the fence, examining the dead grass with a focused attention she gave all things. Hazel sat on a bench in her coat, her breath clouding in the cold air, watching. She didn't see the man until he was at the gate. He had come through a gap in the perimeter, not the main gate, somewhere along the east fence where the camera had apparently developed a blind spot. He was heavy-set, with a grey parka and the specific look of a man who had decided the risk was worth it. He stood just inside the property line, 10 feet from where Isla crouched. "Hey." His voice was low, directed at Hazel. "You the nanny?" Hazel stood up. She didn't panic, but something cold and precise moved through her. She stepped between the man and Isla without making it look like that's what she was doing. "I think you've made a wrong turn," she said. Her voice was level. "Dorian Beck says hello," the man said. "He wants Vaillancourt to know his reach isn't as long as he thinks, starting with the things closest to him." He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a phone, pointed at them, recording. Hazel did not look back at Isla. She kept her eyes on the man, her body completely still, her voice when she spoke completely quiet. "I need you to leave this property right now." "Or what?" He almost smiled. "You're gonna chase me?" She reached into her coat pocket and pressed the emergency alert on the security fob Bruno had given her on day 1. The one she'd thought was a formality. 3 seconds later, she heard running from the direction of the house. She didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, between the man and Isla, and she looked at him with an expression that said, with absolute clarity, "You will not get past me." The men arrived in 30 seconds. The intruder was on the ground in 40. Renaud reached Hazel and put a hand on her arm. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. She turned then and crouched down to Isla's level. The girl was looking at her with wide, still eyes. Not crying, not shaking, just looking. "It's okay," Hazel said softly. "He's gone. You're safe. I've got you." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, the small girl reached out and put both hands on Hazel's face, the way children do when they want to be absolutely sure of something, and leaned forward. And she spoke. One word, said very quietly against Hazel's cheek, in a voice that sounded like it had been stored away somewhere very deep for a very long time. "Hazel." Renaud, who was standing 4 feet away, went perfectly still. One of the other guards turned around. The property was silent except for the cold wind off the lake. Hazel did not cry because she didn't want Isla to think something was wrong. She wrapped her arms around the small girl and held on, her voice steady, her heart doing something enormous and quiet inside her chest. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'm right here." Marcus was sitting across from 2 of the Beck's family's intermediaries in a downtown office when his phone buzzed with a message from Renaud. He read it once. Read it again. Excused himself from the table with a brevity that made both intermediaries sit up straighter and walked into the corridor. He called Renaud. "She spoke," Renaud said, before Marcus could say anything. "One word. Hazel's name. She's calm. They're both fine." Marcus stood very still in the empty corridor, his hand against the wall, and said nothing for several seconds. And the intruder? Contained. Beck's family. It was a provocation, not an attempt. He's being handled. The gap in the east fence. Being addressed as we speak. Hazel. He said her name the way people said words they were turning over carefully. Was she frightened? Renaud paused. She stood between Isla and the man and didn't move. One of the boys said she looked like she was made of concrete. The silence stretched. "I'm coming home," Marcus said. He found Hazel in the kitchen. Again. She had, apparently, responded to a traumatic incident by making soup, which he was beginning to understand was simply how she processed the world. Isla was asleep upstairs. Renaud had confirmed she'd gone down easily, curled against Hazel's side with her thumb near her mouth the way she hadn't slept since she was 2. Hazel looked up when Marcus walked in. She was stirring something that smelled like his mother's kitchen in winter, and there was a tension she was carrying in her shoulders that she was doing a very competent job of not showing. He sat down at the island without being invited. "Renaud told me what happened," he said. "He moved fast," Hazel said. "Your whole team, I want you to know that." She was deflecting. He noticed. "Hazel." She stopped stirring. "You stood between my daughter and a man you didn't know," Marcus said. "You didn't run. You didn't freeze." "She was right there," Hazel said simply. "Where else would I stand?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. In his world, loyalty was a transaction. It was purchased or inherited or enforced. He had not, in a very long time, encountered something that looked like this, instinctive, unconditional, offered without any apparent awareness that it was remarkable. He got up, walked around the island, and gently took the wooden spoon from her hand. He set it down. Then he tilted her chin up with 2 fingers, the way someone did when they needed to see a person clearly, and he looked at her, not assessing, not reading, just looking. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "That's the most honest answer I've had in years," he said. He was close enough that she could see the gray at his temples in detail, the old thin scar along his jaw. The way his eyes, up close, weren't black at all, but a dark, complicated brown. She had spent 4 months in this house telling herself that her feelings about him were simply the proximity effect of an unusual situation, that it was stress chemistry, nothing more, that a man like Isla Vaillancourt looked at women like Hazel Brousseau with the courteous indifference of the very powerful. But he was not looking at her with indifference. "Marcus," she said, meaning it as a gentle warning. "I know," he said. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. "I know what I am. I know what this house is. You deserve to know that before anything else." He looked at her steadily. But I have watched you walk into a room and make my daughter feel safe when nothing and no one else could. I have watched you feed men who are afraid of me, and argue with me about cookie logic, and sit on a cold floor in a doorway because you understood what a child needed before any specialist with $1,000 hour could. You think you don't belong in this house, Hazel. You're wrong. You are the only reason this house is worth coming home to. Hazel looked up at him for a long moment. She had spent 26 years being looked past, overlooked, underestimated on CTA platforms, in waiting rooms, across interview desks, in restaurants where she wasn't the kind of woman anyone assumed would end up at the good table. She had made peace with most of it. She had not stopped wanting, somewhere very private, to be seen. He was seeing her. You're a very complicated man to feel things about, she said. A sound came from him that took a moment to identify, a real, low laugh. The first one she'd heard from him in 4 months. Yes, he said, I've been told. He kissed her once, slowly, with the same controlled deliberateness he applied to everything, and then with less control because she kissed him back when they finally separated. Hazel's hands were against his chest, and the soup was starting to need attention, and neither of them moved for another moment. The Beck situation, she said eventually, will be handled. Isla heard his name. She might have understood more than we think. Then it will be handled quickly. His hands were still at her waist. You're not leaving. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. I'm not leaving, she said. In the months that followed, the Vaillancourt estate changed in ways that were subtle, and then, quietly, total. Isla spoke again the next morning, 2 words to Marcus over breakfast, more please, and Marcus sat very still at the kitchen table for a moment before responding in a voice that was, for the first time in a long time, not composed at all. The speech therapist, when they finally found one Isla would tolerate, a soft-spoken woman from Gatineau, who arrived without a briefcase full of structured protocols and simply sat on the floor with the same patience Hazel had shown on that first day, made more progress in 6 weeks than the previous 4 combined. The men at the front gate started calling Hazel by her name instead of the nanny. Renaud began deferring to her instincts about Isla with a naturalness that would have surprised him if he'd been asked to predict it. Marcus became, by most measurable standards, a more dangerous man, because he was no longer a man who had nothing left to lose, but inside the stone walls of the Beaconsfield house, on evenings when the kitchen smelled like his mother's kitchen and his daughter sat on the counter, narrating her own thoughts in the careful, deliberate voice of a child, relearning language, he became something else entirely. The syndicate that moved around him noticed the change. He was colder in rooms, faster in decisions, implacable in a way that had always been professional but was now something more personal. One of the Beck's intermediaries told his employer, after their next meeting, that Vaillancourt had found something worth protecting in a way that went beyond territory. They were right, he had. And she was currently standing in his kitchen in a flour-dusted apron, arguing with Renaud about whether butter tarts counted as a balanced breakfast, while Issa sat on the counter beside her with a wooden spoon and a look of complete, unhurried peace on her small face. The face of a child who had finally found the one place that felt like a home. I keep thinking about the moment Isla put both hands on Hazel's face. Not the gunshot, not the kiss, not even the final scene in the kitchen. That moment. A 4-year-old who hadn't trusted a single person in 18 months, reaching out with her small hands to make sure something was real. That image stays with me because it's the most honest thing in the whole story. Children don't negotiate. They don't give second chances out of politeness. When Isla chose Hazel, she chose her for exactly one reason. Hazel had shown up, consistently, without an agenda, and stayed. That's the part I find myself sitting with. Hazel didn't arrive at that estate with credentials or a strategy. She arrived broke, tired, and honest about both. She sat on a cold floor in a doorway because she understood, without being told, that the worst thing she could do was push, that kind of reading of a situation, knowing when to move and when to wait, knowing the difference between presence and pressure. That's not something you learn in a classroom. It comes from paying attention to people your whole life, especially people who couldn't advocate for themselves. Hazel had been doing that since she was old enough to hold her grandmother's hand. What strikes me about her is that she never stopped thinking clearly, even when things got frightening. When the man appeared at the fence, she didn't freeze and she didn't run. She positioned herself between him and Isla, and she pressed the button on a fob she'd been carrying for weeks without ever expecting to use. That's what I'd call clear-headed courage, not the dramatic kind, but the kind that's already done the quiet preparation long before the moment arrives. She'd taken Renaud's fob seriously. She'd learned the layout of the property. She'd built trust with the security team, one batch of cookies at a time, which sounds small until you understand that those men responded in 30 seconds. And then there's the matter of what she did after. She made soup. She stood at a stove and made something warm because that was how she metabolized fear, by turning towards something useful, something nourishing, something that took care of the people around her. That's not weakness dressed up as strength. That's a person who has faced enough hard things to know that the answer, almost always, is to keep your hands moving and your door open. I think about Marcus in all of this too. He was a man surrounded by people who needed something from him, and who had stopped being able to tell the difference between loyalty and transaction. Hazel didn't need anything from him except the job, and even that she held without desperation once she found her footing. She stood in his kitchen and argued with him about cookie logic. She fed his guards without asking permission. She told him the truth when he asked if she was all right rather than giving him the answer that would make him comfortable. That kind of moral steadiness, saying the real thing even when the easier thing is available, has a way of changing a room. It changed that whole house. What Hazel had, and what she never apologized for, was a refusal to be made small by the circumstances that had tried to make her small. That refusal, held quietly and without performance, turned out to be the most powerful thing in a house full of very powerful men.